Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Craig VanSandt. I teach at the University of Northern Iowa and hold the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics there. As you may be aware, this summer President Trump announced via a series of tweets, and I quote, "The United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military." He also issued a directive that same day that called upon the Secretary of Defense, in consultation with the Secretary of Homeland Security, to submit a plan for his approval for implementing the ban and determining whether or not to allow transgendered persons already in the military to stay. But before we get into the particulars of this issue, I would like to introduce our panelists. We're privileged to have with us Bob Rush, a former Iowa State Senator and attorney here in Cedar Falls with the law firm of Rush and Nicholson. Bob, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Greg.
Next, I'd like to welcome Amanda Green, the co-founder of Rockwell Collins Pride and a member of the LGBT community.
Yep.
Amanda, thank you for agreeing to be on the show with us.
Thank you.
And finally, I'd like to welcome back Pete Welch to the show. Pete is an attorney with the Elderkin Perney law firm and is a former moderator on Ethical Perspectives on the News. Pete, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much, Craig.
Thank you. Well, despite the White House's statement that the ban in question does not discriminate or violate LGBT rights, two lawsuits alleging precisely that have been filed in federal court. In addition, a bill has been introduced in the Senate that would block the ban. Secretary John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, one of the sponsors of the bill, said in a press release, and again I quote, "Any member of the military who meets the medical and readiness standards should be allowed to serve, including those who are transgender." So the question before us today is whether it is ethical to ban a certain segment of our society from serving in the military. And that question in turn depends partly on whether there are valid, logical reasons for such a prohibition. So I'd like to turn now to our panelists to help us explore these questions. And Amanda, I'd like to talk to you first. In his tweets, President Trump mentioned, and again, I quote, "tremendous medical costs and disruption" as reasons for his directive. Would you respond to the validity of those claims?
Sure, thank you. So the Rand Corporation did a study in 2016 that showed the U.S. military spends 10 times annually, they spend 10 times as much annually on Viagra as they do on trans-related health care. So 10 times as much on Viagra. So it's not really about the military, just like it's not about which bathroom I use, or just like it wasn't about the drinking fountains or which seat you sat at the lunch counter. It's about enabling discrimination and labeling a certain group of people as other. And when you do that, when you label a group of people as other, they're inherently unequal. We've been over that in the Supreme Court. Separate is inherently unequal. So what you see when that happens is disproportionately certain groups are the victims of oppression and discrimination and even violence at higher rates. So this military ban enables that kind of language and that kind of sentiment to be empowered. It allows that to grow. So it's a movement of discrimination as opposed to an actual issue of cost.
So it sounds like you pretty much categorically reject the reasons that President Trump gave for this.
I do. Especially when you look at the percentage of funding spent annually on the healthcare as opposed to some other issues that if it were really about funding, we could address the big ticket items first. That's what you do in a budget.
Sure. So, okay, well, I want to come back to some of those questions, but let me get the other panelists involved here.
Sure.
Pete, in addition to your legal expertise, I understand from talking with you that you are a military veteran as well and served on submarines.
Yes, that's true.
Let me put this in context. Especially in a submarine, you're in a pretty contained space. Could you talk to the potential disruptions of having a transgendered person on a submarine?
Well, a submarine is a pretty focused community and is not your traditional military environment. Rather than be specific to a submarine, I think overall you need to talk about your military force in the bigger picture. And the military force for our country should be reflective of the people that make up the country. I happen, in 32 years of serving in the military and then being an advocate in Washington, D.C., as a lobbyist for the military and veterans, your military force supports the makeup of the country and should reflect that. I think McCain is spot on this particular thing, saying this makes no sense what President Trump said. The qualifier in the military shouldn't be your color, it shouldn't be your sexual preference, it shouldn't be any number of other things, whether you've got one eyebrow higher than the other or something doesn't make sense. Can you do the job required physically and in some circumstances mentally? Serving on a submarine, they threw me into a box and turned up the pressure to see whether I could withstand the rigors of being submerged and I was months on end. Can you do the job that's required? So to say that one category we're going to pick and say no, especially when it represents a segment of our society and our country, doesn't make sense to me.
And if I remember right, I am not a veteran, but if I remember right, the various times of integration, whether it be race, religion, sex, gender preference, whatever, the military has often been a leader in our society in that integration effort, haven't they?
They have, but they also reflect the problems, because the problems will boil to the surface quicker in the military because of the extreme pressures of the environment or the places you go and the things you do, whereas society as a general can maybe ruffle over it and ignore it. But yes, it has been in many times a leader, and in some times it's not a leader. But it should be reflective of the society it's protecting and representing.
Okay, thank you. Bob, let me turn to you. As an attorney, I'd like to talk with you about some of the legal ramifications of this ban. In your view, is this discrimination? Does it violate people's rights?
Clearly it's discrimination. There's no doubt about that. But that's not to say that all forms of discrimination are unlawful. For example, if I'm not physically fit, the military has no obligation to take me into service if I can't perform the job physically. If I'm mentally incompetent, there's no right to serve in the military as if you're not fit. And I think this law, the several lawsuits that are pending now involving the president's actions, and it would suggest to me that fundamentally, equal protection under the law is what it's all about. That we can't, as Pete points out, we can't just pick out a segment of the population and say, oh, gee, Amanda, so sorry you can't serve. That's not what our Constitution is all about.
Well, you anticipated one of my follow-up questions, which was, is all discrimination illegal? Can you think of a justification for discriminating against transgendered people in the military?
Well, there's been no evidence showing that there's some overwhelming weakness in our system by employing transgender people in the military. Quite the contrary, I'd say all the evidence is suggestive that they serve as honorably as anyone else, and more so sometimes.
Okay. Amanda, you, going back to the cost question, you mentioned the RAND report in 2016. I also saw some of that, and as with many other government estimates, the estimates of number of transgendered people in the military ranges from 1,300 to 6,600. I mean, that's a fairly broad range, but out of a force of 1.3 million, that's 0.5%. And the additional cost, Rand said, would be less than 0.1% of additional cost. What kinds of costs would be involved in it?
So as with any medical procedure, the healthcare depends on the individual needs of that patient. And there are several different procedures and treatments that are offered as part of, this umbrella term called trans healthcare. But the real issue is not that, these different treatment options exist, but that there's been this gross exaggeration of what those actually cost. Both insurance companies, of corporations, and also the military. It's negligible, as you've pointed out, percentage-wise, and that can only lead me, when there's no justification for it logically as an argument, to the assumption that this is, something that has ulterior motive in making these statements. What benefit is being served by having the U.S. public and the military itself focus on this issue, focus our budget and our time on this trivial, incremental piece of the budget, and what greater purpose is, attempting to be served? Because, as we've all kind of discussed, there doesn't seem to be a logical explanation for that argument.
Well, I tell my students in my ethics class that I enjoy playing the devil's advocate. I'm not so sure I enjoy that here, but I'm not hearing any justification from any of you for this ban. Is there any possible justification?
I don't know that it's a justification. I think what gets caught in some people's craw is that, we've always had in the military members of, whether you're gay or, minorities, and they've always had health care. But when it comes to people saying, I want a sex change operation, that's what gets stuck. And in fact, the thing that's been played out was this Bradley Manning release of documents, where he was releasing documents and then went through a trial. Well, it's not a man anymore; it's a woman, and I think first name Chelsea, and even got paroled by Clinton, or not by Clinton, by the last President Obama. Commuted, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that it's that issue that brings this up, bubbling to the surface. And Trump may be reacting just in a visceral way, saying, I'm just going to not ever let that happen again. But I think McCain and what he introduced is right, because we've got to reflect the society we're protecting.
I think, Craig, in some respects, the president's sort of tweeting policy changes like what he did was unfortunate because the military was in the process of a study, as I understand it, to report back in 6 months with the results of the study.
And that process was actually started during the Obama administration, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, following on Bob's point, I think the service heads, rather than jump off on Trump's statement, delayed it even further to say, well, we need to get this right if we're going to do it. And the service, not unlike Washington, D.C., is like a big aircraft carrier, and you just can't turn that thing on a dime overnight. And I think that's part of our president's frustration in dealing with politics in D.C.
Well, Pete, let me come back to you specifically about the military. I mentioned that I am not a veteran, but I was very fortunate about 6 years ago to be invited to teach at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I gained a tremendous amount of respect for the military officers that went there. One of the things that struck me particularly was how strong the organizational culture is. And they differ between the different branches of service, but they are uniformly incredibly strong. Would you see that culture enhancing or facilitating transgendered members, or keeping them as outcasts?
One of the things that I did later in my career came because I served in what are called Purple Commands. And Purple Commands are joint unified commands. For example, the Supreme Allied Commander in the Atlantic that I worked for, and it consisted of all of our military forces contributing officers to the effort, in addition to 19 NATO countries. And so the combination of the effect is that you learned diversity and change and things like that of others. And all of our military officers in the American services bring them back to their own services. Because you always hear a big thing like, the Navy and the Army game where they're cheering against each other and stuff. But learning tolerance of the services, the countries, and the different traditions, as we get more communicative, a lot of that is permeating back and infiltrating that culture that before was very closed and not open to change, and is changing more so now as we speak.
Okay. You mentioned the diversity within the military. Tom Friedman in the New York Times has written recently a series of columns about the diversity that he encountered in the U.S. military in the Middle East, as opposed to President Trump's apparent attempts to try and divide the country. I just thought that was an interesting parallel to what you were saying. Amanda, do you have some thoughts about that whole diversity issue?
Yeah, that was a really interesting perspective to hear, and I'm also not a veteran. Thank you for your service. But it's interesting to hear about that globalization affecting, diversity and acceptance and awareness and, inclusion, because at a corporate level, corporations are moving that same way. There's a huge push toward globalization in corporations and in business. And with that comes, new understandings, new people, new cultures, new respect, new learning experiences, and diversity. And so that is part of why I helped start the Pride ERG at Rockwell Collins, because we realized there are these great diverse communities out there, and they all offer individual aspects of quality. When you get a room full of people who are different together to problem solve something, you have more opportunities for creative, solutions to your problems. And rather than fight that somehow, why, you should embrace it and benefit from it. And I think the military sees the value in that, and corporations have now started to see the value in that and promote that in their workplace culture and environment as well.
I think too often, Craig, corporations have been a punching bag, sometimes deservedly so, but I think they get credit here for the bigger companies leading the way on getting rid of discrimination, and I think we should recognize that.
Well, the unanimity of your views about this ban leave me a little bit at ends. What can we do to oppose it if we all are saying this is unethical, it's illegal, it's the wrong thing to do? What do we do?
Well, let me take a stab at it. Contact your congressperson, communicate to your elected officials what your thoughts are on this subject. Urge them to support laws that prohibit discrimination.
Okay. Pete, ideas?
Well, and Bob and I were both talking, this is a prohibited discrimination as opposed to discrimination based on doing a job. And like Bob talked about, the physical capability of doing something. There, it's discrimination, but it for a purpose.
Right.
I mean, if you were a mother of a young soldier and was told that he had to be off in a foxhole, but he was with another soldier that was incapable of dragging him back to the front lines, and he died because of it, you don't want to do anything like that. If you got requirements for a job, there haven't been any SEALs that have frankly been women because of the physical requirements. So some things are going to be that way, and they look discriminatory, but it's because what they got to do. But to blatantly say this, and again, Bob says you got to contact your people that represent you in Washington. There's better minds in the military that are saying, whoa, that's why they didn't immediately jump to the tweet, and you feedback and you let your voice be known, and eventually you'll carry the day. But it's not always going to be easy or quick. I mean, not any of us in this room have the number of followers that our president does on Twitter or anything else.
Not anywhere near. Amanda, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with those sentiments. I would add a bullet point, a little asterisk, that the Navy SEALs, there have not been very many, if any, cisgendered Navy SEALs, but there was actually a trans woman Navy SEAL, Kristen Beck, that was part of SEAL Team 6, and she has actually made specific reference to this ban, saying, I'm not capable of serving my country. I wasn't a valuable, piece of this movement. I would love to talk to President Trump about this ban and about, the fact that what he's doing is wrong, because people like me wouldn't be able to serve. I think that our justice system and our laws and our basic society lends towards equality, and I think that the laws in our court systems will eventually, protect our current trans service members, as well as welcome anyone who wants to serve and who is physically capable of meeting those minimum requirements, and then everything else is irrelevant.
Let me pick up on that word eventually. Let's assume that this ban does go into effect, and that for some reason the military says the transgendered people who are already in the military are no longer welcome, you're going to be discharged. is that then
A flood,
lawsuits?
it's a flood of lawsuits, and I would like to think that at some point, as those suits work their way up to the top U.S. Supreme Court, that court might say, enough. Discrimination in this instance is unlawful. Period.
Okay. And in your best guess, how long would that take?
Well, Supreme Court can move with some speed, but it would be most likely a year at the earliest. Some of us remember how quickly they moved on Gore versus Bush within days and weeks of an election. So
Right.
in the right situation, a court can move quickly, but sometimes there's a reason for a court to let the case evolve and not to jump in until it reaches the point.
Okay. And would there be any reason to allow it to percolate?
Well, I'm trying to think of some good reasons, but I would like to think that this would be a matter of importance for the court to step in and invite the parties to adjudicate it sooner than later.
As a fellow attorney, I'd agree with Bob that at some point in time there would be enough lawsuits filed, enough attention would be garnered, and eventually the courts would sit there and say, okay, we've got to do something about this. Because clearly, in my opinion and in Bob's opinion, it's discriminatory.
Well, as I said, we seem to have a unanimous opinion here, which doesn't always happen on this show. We are running short on time. Can I ask each of you for some concluding thoughts? Bob?
Contact your congressperson. Let them know where you stand on the issue.
Amanda?
I would just ask that people become aware of the impact that these kind of issues have on certain populations, particularly trans women of color, and the disproportional rates of violence against them, and the fact that our actions or even our tweets have real world consequences for real human beings.
I'm smiling at the tweets part. I shouldn't. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Pete?
No, my having gone into the military during the Vietnam era and walking through airports getting spit on, I just think it's great that the public says nice things about the military these days.
Yes, you and I are of the same vintage. I remember those days not so fondly.
Okay.
On behalf of the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. You did a great job, and I'd like to thank all of you for watching. Have a great week.